Thank you all so much for being here for this panel on what we learned about education from the 2022 cycle. Thank you, ASU+GSV, for having me back again this year. It is always an honor to be part of this incredible conference, and I'm just thrilled to have this opportunity. My name is Emma Bloomberg. I'm the founder and CEO of Murmuration, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting civic engagement in the furtherance of equity in communities across our country. We prioritize public K-12 education and work with community-based organizations across the country, providing them with data, tools, analytics, applied research, and broader research and strategic supports, all in the hopes of building greater capacity in the sector to drive sustainable and systemic change. As part of our work with our partners in 2022, we did 159 electoral races in 19 states and the District of Columbia, in addition to working nationally with our organizing and advocacy partners. And I'm just thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to my esteemed panelists about everything that we have learned and what we think that means going forward. So I have had the pleasure of getting to work with all four of these wonderful people and know them all quite well, but assuming that many of you don't, I have asked them all for their robust resumes, and if you'll indulge me for a minute, I will read just a little bit about all of them so you know who you are listening to and why. So let's start with you, John. John is a strategic advisor to entrepreneurs, policymakers, investors, and philanthropists, including the Walton Family Foundation, A Street Ventures, and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and his portfolio involves a broad range of issues, including education, workforce development, youth mental health, climate tech, and COVID response and recovery. He's also a fellow and moderator at the Aspen Global Leadership Network and alumnus of the American Council of Germany's Young Leadership Program, and serves on the boards for the Aspen Institute's Future of Work, which hopefully we'll get into a little bit, Pope Francis Scholars Institute, the Bush Institute, CDT, and CERN Math.
Can you change my bio to wants to be John?
Yeah, exactly. It's all right. Yours is equally robust, Darrell. But let's go down in order. Julia, who I've had the pleasure of working with over the last year on some of our Gen Z research, is VP at SocialSphere, which is a public opinion research and consulting firm. She's a political and communications strategist in her own right who has advised some of the country's most respected leaders and has led campaigns at the national, state, and local levels for over a decade. She's the former director of opinion research for the Biden-Harris campaign and deputy campaign manager for Amy Klobuchar's 2020 presidential campaign. Darrell is the president of 50 Can, which Murmuration is honored to have as a longtime partner. He has more than 20 years of experience in education reform policy and advocacy, and in his role, Darrell trains, recruits local leaders across the country to serve as executive directors of state cans, advocacy fellows, and citizen advocates. He leads the National Voices Fellowship, which focuses on education policy, media, and political collaboration, and is a member of the organization's executive team. And again, Darrell, honored to have you here. And finally, Sarah Scamper is the Chief Research Officer at Murmuration, where she sets the organizational research strategy and leads an interdisciplinary team focused on research and development. She is a neuroscientist by training and has spent her career trying to understand complex behavior, most recently college students and the American electorate, and is particularly interested, exactly.
No pressure.
And is particularly interested in understanding what motivates and drives civic participation with different populations and how that can be used to contextualize and elevate the importance of educational equity. So thank you again all for being here. I know we're eager to dig in, so let's just start with a little bit of the context. Going into the 2022 midterms, if we were thinking about education, education was really at the center of the political divide. We had frustrated and angry voters. We had schools under increasing scrutiny, perhaps more than any time in the past 40 years. Those of us working in and around schools were, in some cases, really truly under attack. School boards became highly politicized, sort of flashpoints in the culture wars. We saw 10 times as many recall votes for school boards across the country, if I'm remembering that correctly. And more broadly, parents and many of the rest of us had more insight into what was happening in the classroom than perhaps any time before. There was sort of this dynamic during COVID where all of a sudden everyone had a window into what kids were doing and how they were doing it. And for better in most cases, but we'll say for better or worse, that motivated a whole lot more people to become engaged in education in lots and lots of ways. So that was sort of the context. And with that, Julia, I'd really love to just start with you. Given all of that context, what role did you expect education to play in the midterms, and what other issues did you expect would motivate voters as well?
Well, thanks, Emma. And I'll start out with that context, a couple specific things that happened in 2021. The first was around that summer, spring-summer 2021, was where we really started seeing some of those culture war issues pop up. Then in the fall, we had what some would say was a surprise election for governor in Virginia. And so we were very interested, as well as a lot of others, going into 2022 about what role education would play. Were voters actually interested in education? What did that mean? And the short answer is yes. So we did a political benchmark in the spring of 2022 and asked voters about a bunch of different issues and found that majority of registered voters, 52%, indicated that education, and we usually specify that as K-12 public education, was a very important issue for them. Interestingly, when we frame the question as, okay, let's look at the future of your community, let's look at the future of the country, how do you think about education then? And among, this is bipartisan, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, over 60% of registered voters said that it was an important issue. So first we are seeing that. The second question that I think is relevant that we asked in that survey as well is, coming out of the pandemic, what do voters envision as the goal for education? Should we focus on going back to normal after the pandemic kind of threw everything in disarray, or should we implement big change? And overwhelmingly across political parties, across genders, across race and ethnicity, this was a national survey, overwhelming majority, almost a supermajority of registered voters said, now is the time for change. So we saw those two indicators. And then the third thing that we saw that we have been tracking, thanks to Emma and others, were that young voters, whether in our quantitative work, whether in our focus groups throughout all of 2022, were very engaged and ready to step up in the November 2022 election, which they did, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But that's really what we we're looking at. While a lot of other prognosticators were fighting over whether there was going to be a red wave or there was going to be a blue wave, we were really watching for an upcoming Gen Z wave.
Thanks so much, Julia. So Sarah, building on that, I wonder if you would mind digging in a little bit deeper on that Gen Z point. In particular, why did we think that Gen Z and younger populations would be a significant voting bloc? But also, just to build on Julia's point on sort of what was important, could you also just go in a little bit on what issues mattered most to them and whether they actually did or did not show up?
Sure. First things first, this doesn't seem promising because I'm looking at the crowd and I'm not saying you all look old, but do we have any Gen Z in the room? No, okay, that's what I thought. Do we have any folks who live with Gen Z? Ish? Yeah, so we have seen a lot of trends with Gen Z lately that make them a really unique voting bloc. And in particular, if you think back to when we were all coming of age, given that none of us are Zoomers, we were looking at turnout trends that were in the 13 to 21%. So for the youth cohort, voters under 30, we were typically seeing, in 2014, that 13% turnout. All of a sudden, Gen Z comes of voting age, and that surges to 28%. And so that was a record turnout that we saw in a midterm election, and really put Gen Z on the map to say, hey, we're here, we're going to show up, and we're going to vote. And I think what's remarkable about this is that, it was in the wake of the Parkland tragedy, it was in the era of President Trump, and more than that, it's amidst a absolutely horrific mental health crisis for this particular generation, where we see that within a 2-week period, around 60% or more are experiencing anxiety, 44% are experiencing symptoms of depression, and 21% are having sort of thoughts that they might be better off no longer with us. And so instead of disengaging and instead of inaction, to have Gen Z turn out in 2018 in that way was really remarkable. And they did it again in 2020. So the general before, in 2016, we had a youth turnout of about 39%. Gen Z came of age, Gen Z showed up, and that surged to 50%. And so they've been on our radar in particular, given that they're a unique voting bloc, given that we know that they prioritize many issues, particularly those around protecting vulnerable populations, where 85% of them are saying it's core to their identity to stand up and to speak for those who can't. And in the context of the 2022 midterms, that meant standing up to protect women and women's rights, reproductive rights, taking a stand against systemic racism and other inequities. And certainly, as we all know, many of those issues were in fact on the ballot this cycle. And so we were very eager to see if that was going to continue to motivate them to show up.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Before we move on, Julia, anything else you'd like to add in terms of the differences between what you expected and what we actually saw, particularly around maybe other issues beyond education?
Well, we certainly saw, as Sarah described, Gen Z is a generation, as well as millennials, but especially Gen Z, who are really uncompromising in their values. And we separate values from issues a little bit. And, obviously the Dobes decision in June of last year was major for the whole country, but especially for Gen Z. That obviously took up a lot of the oxygen in the elections. And we say, the potential for education, there always is the potential, but, with abortion, rising inflation, there were certainly other things that we were watching. And this is a generation that, cares about those things too.
Thanks so much. So with that as some context, I'd love to just dive in a little bit deeper into what happened. John, who were the big winners in the midterms, and what insights did you glean from talking to voters or exit polling to really sort of explain what happened more broadly?
Well, the big losers, I think, were Republicans. They massively underperformed. There was a lot of talk about a Republican wave. You talked about presidential approval rates that were really low. Economic conditions. We don't talk enough about inflation. You're not going to hear inflation really talked about at this conference, but that squeezes a lot of middle income and low income families. And so there's a lot of expectations, I think, that Republicans were going to have a pretty big wave inside, and instead it was the opposite. This is the thinnest majority that Republicans have had in the House in quite some time. The Senate pretty much stayed almost exactly the way it was before the election cycle. And so I think you had this massive underperforming, but it feels to me like the signal that a lot of voters sent, you could see this at the state level and at the federal level, is that usually when voters are frustrated, when they're anxious, they funnel that into voting for change. And this felt like much more like voting for stability. Kristen Soltis-Sanderson talked about people are just looking for any harbor and any port in which to park their boat. And you sort of saw that with, again, handing a little bit of a divided government in Congress, but these thin majorities. But you also saw it, I think, play out at the state level, where this was a very good year to be an incumbent. If you were an incumbent, you not only won, but you won by pretty big points. So just to give you a couple examples, Republican Bill Lee in Tennessee won re-election by 33 points. It campaigned on a bit of education reform, including support for charter schools and also reforming the state school funding formula. Governor DeWine swept the 63% of Ohio votes after a campaign focused on early child care and also mental health. There you had a Republican governor put over $1 billion towards mental health, navigating a lot of the culture war issues and soaring to re-election. Jared Polis won re-election in Colorado by 16 points after campaigning on universal preschool and supporting charter schools. So again, you saw, I think, it was a good year to be incumbent, bad year to be a challenger. You saw similar trends, I think, play out among state legislatures. Democrats actually flipped the chambers in Michigan. The first time that's been done in, I think, 80 years, give or take. You now actually have the sort of the balance of power trifectas, like where do parties own the governorship in both chambers? Republicans have 23 trifectas, but voters in Maryland, Michigan, and Minnesota gave Democrats additional trifectas, bringing their total to 14. So again, I think it was a really big surge for Democrats, massive underperforming for Republicans. The stability theme, though, I think is the thing that jumped out at me. Also, we saw they did exit polls, as they always do, and they asked a number of questions about education. So they asked some questions about, in K through 8 schools, are we teaching too much about race and about gender ideology or gender orientation? And it was fascinating sort of seeing their voters, 34% of voters think schools are teaching too much about racism, 40% say too little, and 23% say about the right amount. But 50% of voters say schools are teaching too much about gender identity, and 20% of them who are Democrats believe that too. So I think there's a more complicated message that was playing out. What's interesting is that they have that data by state, and it almost maps to where the most contentious school boards were, is where some of the highest heat there was. But it wasn't uniform. There are plenty of places where a lot of the exit pollers are feeling that schools are getting this right. And so there's a couple hotbeds around the country. And that's where you're seeing it play out, as Emma was just saying, in these really polarized school board elections.
Thanks so much, John. Darrell, I'd love to pull you in here. How did you see the national education debate differing from or actually playing out at the local levels? And were there any sort of key differences that you observed across states or specific geographical areas?
Yeah, so thanks for having me back, Emma. Thanks, ASU+GSV. Thanks for this fancy can of water.
I'm glad
and also, don't go after Bailey, because he just says all your shit, because that's what he just did. So it was real good.
We have a 30-second delay for the video.
Right. We are being recorded.
All right. So the
Family-friendly audience here.
No one told me I was going to have to bleep.
Is this thing on?
My responses are basically ditto.
So a couple of things. So three things I thought were going to happen. So on the back of the Youngkin victory in Virginia, New Jersey and Virginia are the off-cycle states on electoral, and there were lots of narratives that had emerged about Glenn Youngkin and education and his. And his closer, and Terry McAuliffe's closer, Randy Weingarten, I guess, and lots of compelling narratives. But to me, what happened there was actually mirrored in New Jersey. New Jersey has 1 million more registered Democrats than it does Republicans. Biden took 60% of the vote when he ran there for the presidency, and Murphy won New Jersey in a squeaker. By Jersey standards, it was a squeaker. There's no reason it should have been that close. What is a thing that New Jersey and Virginia, other than having being bedroom communities for DC and New York? I'm just keeping it real, what do they have in common? They were top 10 in school closures in terms of duration of school closures, right? And so this was a big deal. I argued it was a big deal not because of the harm that was done, but because these are places that prize their bundling of home and school. It is essential to their identities. And so I'm just gonna, here it comes, right? So all the rich white people who are like, oh, I got my great private school that is bundled in my $1 million mortgage, so you give me what I want. For them, the terms of the deal had been broken, right? And they were looking for an opportunity to show how upset they were with our elected leaders. This was the first chance they had to do it, and they did it, right? And so the lesson for me from that was that there was enormous unrest in the form of betrayal between families and local public schools as an institution of governance, and that they wanted to be heard. They were looking for an opportunity to express this. I think Republicans, as far as the midterms were concerned, didn't latch onto that in a way at the national level in a way that channeled it, and so got no bump out of it. I feel like at the state level, very much to John's point, we called it a purple swell, because we also felt like this was sort of an election about sanity, that there were two things that sort of presented themselves. One is, if you don't believe in election results, keep it to yourself, because the electorate believes in them and is willing to punish you for it, and they did, and about which I was pleased. Two is that, while we are in a world of competing visions on education, people who had visions won, right? People who had no vision lost, right? And so, maybe like, I can't remember what her name is, the woman who ran who ran in Michigan, but like her vision, though clear, was very incomplete. And I think I'm being sort of generous there. Bill Lee, Ron DeSantis, however you feel about it, Jared Polis, the governor of Kansas, she expanded open enrollment the cycle before. The governor of Idaho, he given like $50 million worth of COVID relief funds to families. Kevin Stitt, the former state chief, switched parties to run against him, and he demolished her, right? Obviously, Ryan Walters, whether or not you support the agendas of any of these folks, these are all people that had very clear visions at the local level, and they were rewarded for this. Penny Schwinn, obviously is a great, Bill Lee's great commissioner in Tennessee. So I would just say, like, one, it's not really a caveat, but a thing that has been unexpected, I think, is, and sort of red state, blue state thing. So in New York, let's say, right, you see Kathy Hochul, who's basically run as a moderate, who in the last debate goes, yeah, I'm for lifting the charter cap, right? The same thing that Lee Zeldin, who was all of these other things that I described earlier, was for. And I was kind of like, well, you could have just been for this at the start, right? You just take it off of the table. That is why I'm not the strategy guy, but that made kind of sense to me. And now she's in a dogfight to do anything. Which is incredibly frustrating. So there is a blue state narrative here that is about doing nothing, I think. And it is like $250 million to tutoring, and both the House and the Senate vote that down. That's a bad message for everyone, right? On the other end, perhaps driven by a different electorate who shows up, and I've said this to people a lot. Like 9 states, I think, passed or redid school choice laws during the pandemic, and there were like 20 other states that took the laws on, and people are like, why did that happen? And I say, well, more people showed up and different people showed up, just to go back to this thing about your house and all this other stuff. And so I've been surprised by the scale of the policies that have been, many of which I'm sort of on board with, that have been passed in the last like year and a half, like post midterm at the state level. And so I think there's a really important story playing out about big change. It's just not playing out in a uniform way, or in a way that I think we would have expected.
Thanks so much, Darrell. Sarah, could you sort of build on some of what we've heard, and just thinking back to some of our post-election research, what are ways we can better engage voters, particularly young voters, on this issue of education, given everything we've learned in 2022 as we look ahead?
Yeah, I think first things first, right? To answer the earlier question, Julia sort of alluded to this. We did see youth voters show up. And we maybe didn't see them show up as education champions because it was in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, and we saw from our spring polling to our post-election polling about a 20% increase in people motivated by reproductive rights rather than education. We still did see education factor. And in particular, I think what's most interesting about thinking about how to mobilize and how to continue to engage young people is that they think about that very holistically. And so when we really dive into what education means, it is not only like older generations about school safety and security, it's also about mental health, it is about gun control, it is about other issues that intersect with education, and it is about the whole student. And so I think when we are trying to sort of get them into the realm of education champions, it's important to think about the whole experience, the whole student, and the way that the school environment is sort of the place where they often experience that, particularly at that age where they are going to come out and vote for the very first time. More than that, when we're thinking about engaging them, the biggest barrier that we encountered in our post-election research was actually that they didn't have enough information. And so we were finding, both for voters and non-voters, an overwhelming majority, 50% or higher, of youth voters and non-voters saying, look, I don't know how this works yet. And I need more information about how to register, where to register, when to register, where do I go vote, who's actually on the ballot, what does school board even mean, and how does that matter to me? And so an overwhelming interest in more information availability, and not only to get them to show up, but then if they do show up, finish the whole ballot. So we had about 15% of young voters who didn't finish the whole ballot. And when you ask them why, 67% or so were saying that it was because they didn't feel confident, they didn't have enough information in order to be sure that they were making the right choices. And so interestingly, they would rather make no choice than make the wrong choice, because they understand the consequences of elections, and so they want to be very certain in who they're actually voting for. And so when we think about, well, how do we engage you? Like, let's make sure we're getting the information out there. Let's make sure that we're talking about and picking candidates who have a platform that talks about the ways that issues are interconnected and puts it, to Julia's point, in the values frame of young people and explains to them why this matters and how this resonates with them and their experience, so that we are starting to engage them in a way that is more meeting them where they are, understanding, you know, the chaos and trauma and the fact that they've never seen a functional political system, and bringing them in a way that is a bit more, you know, warm and open arms, I think.
Thanks. I am realizing one quick bit of housekeeping. We are going to try to leave a few minutes for audience questions, so if you have them, start to think about what they might be. With that, you know, John, as we are looking ahead to 23, 24, 25, even 26, how are you thinking about the role of education in these elections, and what should we be aware of?
Yeah, just building on a couple of the other points. I mean, one of the other things we learned is from this last cycle is like anger is not a strategy, and it's also not a plan. But you had, and Darrell made this point, but you saw the Republican governor candidate in Maryland had a 5-bullet education plan, and it was, you know, end culture wars and kids were shut out of school. But that's not a plan. Like Wes Moore had like a 52-page plan that included Republican ideas. He included baby bonds, which is something Rick Santorum had proposed you know, over 15 years ago. So it's like having robust plans is important. But also now, I think that's where folks are going to turn. It's enough about whether or not kids were in school or out of school and who was responsible for that. That'll still fuel some anger. But now people are on the hook for learning recovery. And what are you going to do to help kids catch up academically, to help with this mental health crisis? The early report cards are very disappointing. Emily Oster did a study that just was released in a prominent economic journal last week, found out that with all the ESSER spending, all the tutoring, kids on average only caught up about 20% in ELA and about 30% of the gains that they needed to make in math. That's unacceptable. And again, I think a lot of governors are going to, over the next 2 years, be held accountable for whether or not kids are getting the help they need academically, and also on the mental health side as well. There's also really difficult policy questions coming up. We have the fiscal cliff with the federal dollars. The more important fiscal cliff to pay attention to is when state funding formulas catch up with enrollment counts, because that's a day of reckoning. When school districts that have 5% population drop, that budget catches up, that's a pretty big budget cut. If we have a recession, which, depending, the Federal Reserve in their minutes last week said that they anticipate a recession sometime this year, and that recovery will last 2 years. Well, that impacts state budgets, which could impact state funding formula that goes into schools. How are we going to navigate that? It's all going to be on governors there. So I think there's a lot of different really substantive political issues that governors are going to have to deal with. And then in 2026, we have this very important wave to be looking at, and that's 36 governor races. And that is the opposite of what we just went through. If this was an incumbent year, because of all the folks getting termed out, that's going to be a bunch of new governors. And so it's really important now, because you're going to see a lot of people beginning to posture for that, but it's also what are the different issues that they're going to have to deal with as well. So 2026 doesn't feel that far away. It's like 3 years away. It's not that far away. And I think that's going to be something that you're going to see a lot of the cycles, and it's going to be important for us as advocates to sort of build up into that.
Thanks so much, John. And one quick point that I probably should have included in context. I assume everyone in this room would have expected some kind of a drop in public school enrollment in the fall of 2020. It was about 2.7% nationally. But I think most of us probably thought that would rebound. And particularly in urban areas, we are not seeing that rebound. In fact, it is continuing to fall. So as you talk about dollars following kids, that's certainly something for all of us to keep in mind. Julia, before we pivot a little bit, we were just talking about the future, the next couple cycles. By 2026, the youth vote is the majority bloc. So how are you thinking about what that looks like?
So to start off, we just had a very decisive election that was not education related, but I think that we can learn a lot from it, which was just a couple of days ago in Wisconsin, right? So as Sarah mentioned, one of what we found is the biggest barrier to young people voting is this lack of information. And in Wisconsin, when they did their initial round of research for the Democratic candidate, they found, surprisingly, that the biggest barrier to voting was that no one knew this election was happening. Now, this is what was a judicial race in Wisconsin, but I'm sure everyone's familiar with education races. Generally, happen in the spring. A lot of them don't happen in November. If they do, it's down ballot. You have issues with ballot drop-off. People don't generally know who's on their Board of Education. They don't know what a Board of Education does. So what we learned in Wisconsin was they took that information, and I should point out that one of the biggest misnomers with young voters on both sides of the spectrum are that young voters are not activists, or at least the young voters that need persuading to vote are not activists. And generally, it's easier to think of them that way, but that's not true. And so what they did in Wisconsin is, instead of doing a normal persuasion campaign with, to John's point about anger is not a plan, they just simply educated. And they said, this is what's happening, this is who's on the ballot, this is who is endorsing each candidate, and these are the issues that are relevant. And numbers are still coming in. It's only been, a week, or 2 weeks now. But every indication is that young voters were very decisive in that election. And so that, I think, is really the perfect game plan to engaging young voters in the future.
Thanks so much. Darrell, before we open it up to questions, as you are thinking about sort of the future of education reform and how young people today and how their families are really thinking about the purpose of education, what's changing, or what should we be keeping our eyes on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have sort of like a marketing statement almost about what we believe. We call it "Believe in Better," because that's what and it's like the 5 promises we think that the education system should sort of present to every child. And I would just say there are 4 things that kind of live underneath of it that are about what we think every child deserves, and we'd like to see the education system sort of move in this way. And a lot of it is, some of the Gen Z stuff we saw sort of last year in the polling too, is like, they tend to be fairly favorable to choice, and I sort of argued that that was because they live in virtual spaces so often, right? That the anchor of a physical place means less in the context of these things. But just one sort of hypothesis. So I guess there's 4 things that are in front of us. One is that we're very supportive of what you see in a lot of places where we're directing funds, to families, right, to make decisions about things. Rich families spend a lot of money on things that happen outside of school. This is sort of like an arms race about enrichment. We want every kid to be able to participate in that. Certainly there's an equity component to that too, but there's also just experience, like trips and places and people, that's a thing. The pandemic, for all of its harm, is not without good things that happen. Like lots of kids found new ways to learn, like matched with sort of the best vision of what they wanted. And kind of to your point, Emma, found out that families found out that they wanted different things from education. Like Todd Rose talks about this a lot. He calls it stated preference and revealed preference. Like most people think that everybody wants like a perfect score in the SAT, an Ivy League degree, a big Wall Street bank job, go out, be like a bazillionaire. And it turns out almost no one wants that. It's just that everybody thinks everybody else wants it. So everybody's like, oh yeah, I want that too, right? And so what is also emerging is like a different, you could call this like multiple definitions of success or like different ways to measure success. Like that's incredibly important. And just to put a bow on this thing of earlier, if you, like the young, like Gen Z in particular, right? Like very focused on issues of injustice, like not to be hyperbolic about it, but there are very few more unjust systems ingrained in public education than that of residential assignment and the enshrined history of redlining that it lives atop of, and all of the unfair and inequitable school finance policies that grow out of that. And so we normally, we take this position about no boundaries. You can think about that lots of different ways. It's an engine of new ways of learning, lots of which we saw during the pandemic. But also really, like, if you care about every person reaching their fullest potential, without the barriers of, in this case, explicitly and named systemically racist things, and I don't use that all the time. I'm using it right now because it's real, then you might want to get behind another set of policies. And we think, we have a lot of, in our Hawaii campaign, we have a youth advocacy, program called WAVE. We got one in Connecticut, we got one in Georgia. They all have different names. Like we want to work with the kids. Like we want to put that, but we want to put kids in a position to sort of to manifest their own destiny. Because I do think, last thing, one thing about being in school and being an adult is that it's like time travel. So when you look at the sun, you're actually looking at what happened 8 minutes ago. And when we talk about school, we're talking about what happened to us 15, 20, 30 years ago. Right? And that has a powerful effect on how you describe policy and what you try to get behind. And kids are in the schools now, right? They're close to the sun, not 8 minutes away from it. They have a different take on a lot of these things.
I am going to apologize for my mismanagement of time. We only have 90 seconds left. If someone wants to ask a very quick question, they can. Otherwise, I have plenty more. Great. Go for it.
Great, yes. Thank you. So I founded and run an organization called School Board Schools. So this is like right up my alley. One of the things that we are launching this year is a school board election awareness campaign. And so I would love to hear from this group. Two-part question in 90 seconds. But
maybe we'll answer it afterwards, but yes. So just quickly, because I'm supposed to repeat the question into the mic so that the recording can hear it. The question is around building awareness around school boards. Who should we talk to, and what are the messages that most resonate? To get people to actually understand what they are and go in 28 seconds.
I'll be very quick, and it's not a direct answer to a question, but it's hire, or if you can't hire, go talk to young people, and they will tell you how to reach other young people.
We're also happy to stay in touch.
Yes.
Higher Murmuration.
Thank you all so much for being here. Always an honor. Thank you to my panelists. I know we could have kept going for another hour at least, but next time.